According to NPR, another former Minneapolis officer, Thomas Lane, who held down Floyd's legs as the man struggled to breathe, was released from federal prison in Colorado on Tuesday, the Bureau of Prisons said. Lane, 41, was serving a 3-year sentence for aiding and abetting manslaughter.
He was sentenced to 3 years in prison for the state charges. Previously, in February 2022, a federal jury convicted Lane, as well as 2 other former officers, for violating Floyd's civil rights when they failed to intervene in his murder in May 2020. He was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for the federal charges. Lane served the 2 sentences concurrently at FCI Englewood in Colorado. His sentence on federal charges expired earlier this year, according to a Bureau of Prisons spokesperson, while his sentence on state charges ended Tuesday. Lane will spend the next year on supervised release, a spokesperson for the Minnesota Department of Corrections told ABC News. Derek Chauvin, the officer who kneeled on Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes, killing him, was convicted on murder charges and sentenced to 22.5 years in prison. In a move unrelated to Lane, Chauvin was moved to a federal prison in Big Springs, Texas, on Tuesday, according to a source familiar with the situation. Chauvin was stabbed at a federal prison in Phoenix last November. In the wake of Floyd's murder, protests against racial injustice and police brutality broke out across the U.S. and even internationally, drawing millions. Thomas Lane served his time and paid his debt to society. I wish him well in his re-entry into his community, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison said in a statement to Duluth ABC affiliate WDIO-TV. Lane must serve 1 year of supervised release, and the Minnesota DOC confirmed that Wisconsin will be in charge of his supervision. When it comes to the state's case, prosecutors and Lane's attorneys had agreed to a recommended sentence of 3 years, which is below the sentencing guidelines, and prosecutors agreed to allow him to serve that penalty at the same time as his federal sentence, and in a federal prison. Lane finished his federal sentence in April. The 41-year-old was found guilty in 2022 of violating Floyd's civil rights. The 46-year-old black man was handcuffed and restrained as he lay on his stomach for more than 9 minutes, telling officers that he couldn't breathe. Lane was only on his 4th day as an officer, CNN noted, and he held down Floyd's legs as he was arrested. Another officer, Derek Chauvin, pushed his knee into Floyd's neck while Officer Alexander Kung held down Floyd's upper body. Fellow Officer Tuthow kept back witnesses as they grew increasingly upset at the scene. Lane asked twice if they should reposition Floyd and gave Floyd CPR after paramedics had placed him in an ambulance. However, prosecutors said he didn't do enough to help the 46-year-old, according to the Minnesota Star Tribune. In July 2022, Lane was sentenced to 2.5 years in federal prison. He was subsequently sentenced to 3 years in prison on the state level later that same year after pleading guilty to aiding and abetting second-degree manslaughter. That came after he faced the charge of aiding and abetting second-degree unintentional murder, but the charge was dismissed as part of the plea agreement. Prosecutors and defense lawyers recommended a 36-month sentence, but a lighter sentence was imposed. Lane served his sentences concurrently at the Englewood prison in Colorado. The low-security prison has about 1,000 inmates. He's the first of the 4 officers to be released. He has a 2-year term of supervision imposed through the District of Minnesota, a spokesperson for the Federal Bureau of Prisons told CNN. Lane finished his federal sentence in June and stayed in detention to finish his state sentence. He left prison on Tuesday morning. The 4 officers were all convicted on both federal and state charges in the death of Floyd. In April 2021, Chauvin was found guilty on the state charges of second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. He was sentenced to 22.5 years behind bars. In November last year, the Supreme Court rejected Chauvin's appeal of the sentence. Chauvin subsequently pleaded guilty to charges of violating Floyd's civil rights on the federal level. He was sentenced to 21 years to be served concurrently with his state sentence. In November 2023, the ex-officer was stabbed at a federal correctional facility in Arizona. The Bureau of Prisons told CNN that Chauvin was transferred on Tuesday to a low-security prison in Texas. Kung and Thou were both found guilty by a federal jury of having violated Floyd's civil rights. Kung was sentenced to 3 years and Thou to 3.5 years. On the state level, Kung pleaded guilty to charges of aiding and abetting second-degree manslaughter in December 2022. On the same state charges, Thou was sentenced to almost 5 years in August last year. Early 2022, a federal jury found Lane guilty of violating George Floyd's civil rights for ignoring his medical needs as former officer Derek Chauvin kneeled on Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes. And later that year, Lane pleaded guilty to a state charge of aiding and abetting second-degree manslaughter. And as many of us will recall, Lane can be seen on video holding Floyd's legs as Chauvin and another officer, Alexander Kung, restrained the 46-year-old black man. A fourth ex-officer, Tu Thao, kept back a group of onlookers who were pleading with the officers to let up on Floyd. Lane asked Chauvin twice whether they should reposition Floyd so he could breathe. But Chauvin rebuffed those suggestions from Lane, who was a rookie in just his fourth day on the job, when he initially confronted Floyd over allegations that he may have used a phony $20 bill at Cup Foods, that corner store at 38th Street and Chicago Avenue. He received the least amount of prison time of the 4 officers and has finished serving it. Judge Paul Magnuson, who presided over the federal trial, gave Lane 30 months. And Hennepin County Judge Peter Cahill, who oversaw the state trials and state cases, sentenced the former officer to 3 years. Lane served those sentences concurrently in a low-security federal lockup in Colorado. At Lane's state sentencing hearing back in 2022, then Assistant Minnesota Attorney General Matthew Frank, who was one of the prosecutors, said Lane deserved a shorter sentence than the other ex-officers because he played a, quote, somewhat less culpable role in Floyd's death. And there were moments when Lane tried to change what was going on that day. Lane's federal term wound up in February, and the prison portion of his state sentence concluded today. Now, the Minnesota Department of Corrections contracted with the Federal Bureau of Prisons to have Lane finish out his state term in the federal pen. Under Minnesota law, most offenders serve the first 2/3 of their sentences in prison, with the rest on supervised release. So Lane will spend the next year on supervised release, and he'll be supervised by Wisconsin. On the federal side, inmates are often eligible to receive a 15% reduction in prison time for good behavior. It's known as the good time credit. He's going to be supervised by the Wisconsin Department of Corrections, but is he coming back home to Minnesota today? Matt Sepik. That's unclear. The DOT keeps these kinds of things fairly quiet, primarily for the safety and security of the person being released. We've seen this before with the release of former officer Kim Potter from prison. A Department of Corrections spokesperson tells us that the Minnesota doc is bringing Lane back to Minnesota for his release. But it will be, as I said, the Wisconsin Department of Corrections that will supervise him through an interstate agreement. That's all they've told us. They would not provide any other details about his supervision and where he'll be living and that sort of thing. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, J. Alexander Kyung and Tu Thao are set to get out of federal prison in April of next year, April 2025. Chauvin, of course, got the longest sentence. He's serving 22.5 years on his state conviction, concurrent with a roughly 20-year federal term on the civil rights charges. He's not expected to be released until 2038. And he started serving his sentence at a federal prison in Tucson, Arizona, but records show just recently he was moved to a transfer facility, a Federal Bureau of Prisons transfer facility in Oklahoma. The Prison Bureau has not said why it moved him. As we have reported over the last few months, the 48-year-old former officer was seriously injured back in November when a fellow inmate, this was just after Thanksgiving, allegedly stabbed him 22 times in a prison law library. And that other inmate, John Terskake, he's 53 years old, a former gang member from California. He's pleaded not guilty to charges of assault and attempted murder. Ex-Minneapolis officer Thomas Lane released from prison after completing 3-year sentence for involvement in George Floyd murder. Reports confirmed that former Minneapolis police officer Thomas Lane completed his 3-year sentence and is now a free man. Thomas Lane served his sentence in Colorado and is expected to go into supervision as the Bureau previously stated he would now that he has been released. As you may recall, the ex-policeman is one of 4 convicted on charges related to George Floyd's 2020 death, which sparked worldwide protests and catapulted the Black Lives Matter movement into mainstream media. While Lane was not directly responsible for the murder, he was convicted on federal charges of violating Floyd's civil rights and was sentenced to 2.5 years in federal prison. He also received 3 years from the state and was charged with aiding and abetting manslaughter. 2 of those years were served concurrently with his federal sentence, which ended on February 26 of this year, according to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Lane is the first of the 4 officers to get out of jail. Derek Chauvin, who held his knee on Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes while he was handcuffed face down in the street over suspicions that Floyd used a counterfeit bill, was ultimately convicted on state charges of murder and manslaughter and sentenced to 22.5 years. In addition, he pleaded guilty to federal charges of violating Floyd's rights and was given a 21-year sentence. As far as the other officers involved, J. Alexander Kung pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 3.5 years, while Tu Thao was convicted of second-degree aiding and abetting manslaughter and sentenced to nearly 5 years. Both were also found guilty of civil rights violations, receiving 3 and 3.5-year sentences, respectively. Reportedly, all of the state and federal sentences are concurrent.
The killing of George Floyd sparked worldwide protests against racism and the excessive use of force by police. Derek Chauvin, who knelt on Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes, was found guilty of murder.
Find the defendant guilty.
But Chauvin was only one of 4 officers charged in Floyd's death. Who were the other 3 police officers, and what did they do that day? Chauvin, a 45-year-old white man with nearly 2 decades of experience on the Minneapolis police force, was the most senior officer of the 4. Tu Thao had served for nearly 11 years, and both Thomas Lane and J. Alexander King were in their first week on the job. Chauvin had served as a field training officer to both Lane and King, responsible for their training and their evaluation. They were the first to arrive on the scene, responding to a 911 report of a counterfeit bill. Thomas Lane, a 38-year-old white man, approaches Floyd as he sits in the driver's seat of a car and pulls out his gun within seconds.
Right now. Let me see your other hand.
16 seconds later, he holsters the weapon and asks Floyd to step out of the car.
Step out and face away. Can you not shoot me, man? I'm not shooting. Step out and face.
With help from King, he handcuffs Floyd. J. Alexander King, age 27, is the youngest and the only black officer of the 4.
All right, what's your name?
George. George Perry Floyd.
King questions Floyd for about 2 minutes.
And you know why we pulled you out of the car? Because you was not listening to anything we told you.
Right, I know what was going on.
You listened to us and we will tell you what's going on.
Ouchie, man.
Are you on something right now?
Lane and King then walk Floyd to their patrol car on the other side of the intersection. Once there, they struggle to get Floyd into the back seat of the vehicle.
I'm not the kind of guy, man. Yo, I'm gonna die here. I'm gonna die, man.
This is when Derek Chauvin and partner Tu Thao arrive on the scene. Tu Thao, age 35, American, had a history of misconduct with 6 complaints on his record, 5 had been posed lawsuits for use of excessive force, and 1 was still under investigation. After Lane pulls Floyd through the car, King and Chauvin drag him to the ground.
Am I out?
This is when the actions of each officer, as King and Chauvin, what they did and did not do, become critical. They pin Floyd face down on the ground. Lane restrains Floyd's legs, while King kneels on his back, and Chauvin kneels with his knee on Floyd's neck. Thao does not restrain Floyd, instead standing between the 3 officers and bystanders. After about 5.5 minutes, Lane asks if they should roll Floyd onto his side.
Roll on the side.
He is the only officer of the 3 who questions Chauvin's actions.
Look at him!
Thao continues to keep back the bystanders, calling for the officers to release Floyd. 2 minutes later, Lane asks again if they should move Floyd. King then checks for Floyd's pulse.
Check his pulse. Check his pulse. Check his pulse, Kyle.
None of the officers intervene or administer medical care. Paramedics arrive on the scene about 8 minutes after Floyd was pulled to the ground. They move him into the ambulance, and Lane rides along to the hospital.
You want one of us to ride with? Yeah.
Floyd was pronounced dead later that night. In the days after Floyd's death, all 4 officers were fired and then arrested. Chauvin was convicted of murder and sentenced to over 22 years in prison. In a federal civil rights trial, Tao, Lane, and King were charged with depriving Floyd of medical care, and Tao and King were charged with failing to intervene. The former officers told the court they trusted Chauvin had things under control and that they did not know he was acting unlawfully.
If you like the video, give it a thumbs up, and if you enjoy the content that I bring to you on this channel, subscribe. I'll see you guys on the next one. Thanks for watching.